must be a random individual who tells us nothing, really, about society as a whole, meaning it tells us nothing about our society. It's just a random, disturbed individual who has somehow cropped up in our society, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's always going to be such people. We'll try and find them, but, what are you going to do, right? Whereas, of course, if we actually say, suppose it's a domestic group lodged in the very heart of the U.S. military-industrial complex, and they did conspire, and they were rational, not nutty, and they knew what they were doing, and they terrorized the population on purpose. Then, if you say that, and it's clear to me that that's what happened, if you say that, suddenly you're accused of being a conspiracy theorist, right? Because those bad guys conspire all the time. That's not interesting. But when you claim that our people, our government might conspire, well then, you're a sleazy and slightly screwed up person. You're a conspiracy theorist. So this whole notion of the lone nut, not only a solitary individual, but an unbalanced and unrepresentative individual, has been extremely important in recent U.S. history. And what it gives is a way of carrying out violent actions that actually have often state institutions behind them. And you throw up this patsy, this Oswald, this James Earl Ray or whatever, and say, well, it's a lone nut again, so really there's no point looking further, nothing to see here, folks, move on. Doesn't tell us anything about the deep structure of the state and what's really going on. It's a very useful position. And in the case of the Anthrax attacks, I think it's the clear limited hangout position, by which I mean you tell some truth and you hide other big truths, as I mentioned before. So when the Iraq al-Qaeda hypothesis just crumbles, you turn around and you say, okay, well, we'll admit it came from U.S. military labs, but we'll say it was a random nut, and we'll find the nut, and we'll make sure he ends up dead, and that's the end of the story, and they won't look any further. And that's, to some extent, what's happened, except that the FBI hasn't been entirely successful in selling the Bruce Ivins story.
Now, were there connections between the so-called 9/11 hijackers and the perpetrators of the Anthrax attacks? Could you talk about the Florida connection of the Anthrax attacks between West Palm Beach and Miami?
Yes, exactly. If you're looking for connections between the 19 so-called hijackers and the Anthrax attacks, that's where I would first look. So I'm looking at a map of Florida right here. There are all kinds of places between West Palm Beach, further to the north, and Miami in the south, where the hijackers, at least 14 out of 19 had Florida connections. They lived there. They went to the gym there. Some of them took flight lessons in Florida. They went to the doctor there. They went to bars there. They hung out there. There's strong, strong connections. So the first thing we notice is that the first anthrax victim, Robert Stevens, dies in Boca Raton, right in the middle of that area. Now that in itself might not seem very strong circumstantial evidence, but it starts to look strong as we narrow in on this. We say, well, who was Robert Stevens? Well, he was a photo editor who worked for a tabloid called The Sun, the sister publication of the National Enquirer. And Stevens seems to have contracted anthrax at his workplace at The Sun, probably through a letter, and he then dies of it. Okay. Well, who was the editor-in-chief of The Sun at the time? It was a man named Mike Irish, whose wife knew two of the hijackers. She didn't just know them. She was a real estate agent. She found apartments for them. So here there's a direct connection between The Sun, where the first anthrax guy dies, and two hijackers, Hamza al-Ghamdi and Marwan al-Shehi, and also Muhammad Atta, the leader, because he co-signed for one of their leases. Now, at this point, any criminal investigator, any homicide investigator would be saying, this is interesting. This is interesting. It's not conclusive. It could be coincidence, but it's looking very interesting. So you'd want to look into that further, and you'd also want to look into any other incidents which seem to tie these 19 hijackers to anthrax, and there are such incidents.
I'm speaking with researcher Dr. Graeme MacQueen. Today's show, Connecting the Anthrax Attacks to September 11th. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Now, what about one of the so-called hijackers showing up at the Department of Agriculture and trying to get a loan?
Right. Well, this is one of several incidents in which some of these 19 hijackers are running around, and they're doing this for about a year and a half, right up to a week before 9/11, expressing interest in small planes which disperse various agents into the air. And most of these are crop duster planes. So here we have guys coming from the Middle East and Afghanistan and so on and saying, you know, my dream is to somehow crop dust American crops. And they're being very out front, very blatant about this. They make sure they're not forgotten. They'll go and have a little fight with somebody who has one of these crop duster planes, and so on and so forth. So the story you're referring to is when the so-called ringleader, Mohammed Atta, comes to ask for a loan. And I can tell you that fascinating story because I really find it tells us a lot about how these things are structured. So Mohammed Atta, and this is, I think, back in spring of 2000. It's quite a long time before 9/11. It's in Florida, and he goes to a woman named Jonelle Bryant, who has a loan office at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He walks in because he understands there's loans being given out, and he explains to her that his name is Mohammed Atta, and he spells his name, that's A-T-T-A. You know, and I'm a young man from Afghanistan, which is interesting because the real Mohammed Atta is from Egypt. It seems odd that he would choose a more suspect country. So he's not really concealing himself very well. He's given his real name. He's claimed to be from Afghanistan. I wanna, spray U.S. crops, he says. And for this, I need a $650,000 loan, which I hope your department will give me. And I'm going to take, a small aircraft and take out all the seats except the pilot's seat and convert it into a kind of crop duster plane by putting a big chemical tank in it. And I'm an engineer, so I know how to do that. And he's pretty rough with her because, I don't want to deal with a woman, but if I have to, blah, blah, blah. Well, she kind of calms him down and says, you can't just walk out of the door with $650,000. There's an application process. And furthermore, I hate to say, you're not an American citizen, so you're not even eligible for the program. Well, he's not very happy being told all this, so he says to her, bear in mind here, this is supposed to be a top secret operative. Obviously, he's planning one of the biggest operations ever on U.S. soil. He's got to be very secret. He's already told them his name. He's expressing aggression. Now he says, what would happen if I just came around behind your desk and cut your throat? And then I could take the $650,000. Talk about making yourself unforgettable. Well, so she doesn't seem very perturbed, Jonelle Bryant. As she tells us to ABC News, she says, well, first of all, I don't carry that cash in my office, and secondly, I know karate. Yeah, so I don't know. She doesn't phone for help or anything. They continue to discuss amicably, and at some point, Mohammed Atta notices that on her wall is hanging an aerial photograph of Washington, D.C., with all the nice monuments marked and everything. He says, oh, that's remarkable. That's beautiful. I've never seen such a clear aerial photograph of Washington, D.C. I need to have it. He starts throwing money down on the counter. Want to buy it? She says, well, you can't buy it. It's a gift. And he gets annoyed again. And he says, well, how would you like it if people from outside the United States came to a country, a city like Washington and destroyed its monuments, right? Again, this doesn't seem to bother her. There's no bells going off at this point. He then turns the conversation to another topic and starts talking about the World Trade Center in New York. What an interesting building that is and how he would like to visit it. And he asks her if she knows how good the security there is. No bells are ringing for Jonelle yet, I guess. Then he switches the topic again. This is all, I'm taking this all direct from the ABC report, okay? Then he says, in Afghanistan where I come from, there's a wonderful man named Osama bin Laden. and one day he will be famous. Okay? So I don't know how this guy could have given her a better sense of what he was up to. But she doesn't seem disturbed. They get up, shake hands, and she wishes him well, and he goes out the door. And it's not until the 9/11 thing happens that Janelle Bryant realizes, gee, maybe he was a terrorist. Maybe that was the famous Muhammad Atta, so then she goes public with it. But when I look at this absurd incident, and friends of mine who have examined it more than I think that it really happened, because I initially thought, this may be totally cooked up by Janelle Bryant, but they say no. She actually existed. They verified it. She did work for that office. She did seem to come forward voluntarily. They think it's genuine. In that case, the whole event is theater. This is not a top-secret operative trying to disguise his identity and get a loan to buy a plane. This is a guy who has been tasked with laying down the most blatant possible track. And what is the track he's laying down? Well, he's going to be the guy known as the head of the 9/11 hijackers, and here he's trying to get a hold of a little plane which he can convert to spray something over the United States. And this is one of several incidents in which they're trying to get hold of planes that they can use to spray stuff on the United States. And, of course, everybody knew in the United States, it's widely known that Iraq had an Anthrax program and that it used fighter jets to spray it. That was their chosen method of dissemination. So I think what's going on here is that clearly a trail is being laid, and we're supposed to follow it. And we're supposed to get the idea later that the same guys who hijacked those planes and did 9/11 were also planning Anthrax attacks. And if they weren't able to do them in the end from the air with their little planes, because the U.S. grounded all crop duster planes, all crop duster planes in the United States were ordered grounded on September 16th. So the idea was, well, I guess they couldn't do it that way, so they resorted to sending around the letters. So this is another example of how a trail was laid down for us to try and say these were all connected. And, of course, what I'm saying to you is that even if it was all theater, it does actually prove that they were connected, because the same choreographers, if you like, were choreographing the Anthrax attacks and the 9/11 attacks, and were insisting we see that they were connected.
Exactly, and this was the narrative that was spun early on. We no longer hear anything about this.
Exactly, right. And we also don't hear about the Anthrax, one of the 19 hijackers, a man by the name of Ahmad al-Haznawi, who went to the doctor with a big black lesion on his leg, which